All right, welcome to another edition of the Edlow Podcast. Subscribe. Everyone who's been listening this time at this point knows that I'm huge into wrestling. Done it, been there, know some guys, and this is one that someone I want to talk to for a really long time. I have Nikita Koloff. Nikita, good to have you.
Well, it's just an honor and a privilege. I know you were sharing just for a minute there, Josh, before we, came onto the podcast. A little bit of your background. Sorry that our paths didn't get crossing the squared circle, but I guess I'm happier they're passing here. I understand you're a big guy, so I'm glad. Yeah. I'm glad that we're crossing paths here on the podcast.
Well, I got to tell you, you were one of the biggest body guys back in the day. I don't know if I ever wanted to cross your path. You were quite the beast, and your stuff in Jim Crockett and NWA, WCW, whatever you want to call it, especially your stuff with Sting was just the stuff of legends. And tell me, it's what I found really interesting about you is your high school class had like a ton of names that came out of it and all kind of trained together.
It's crazy to really think about. Maybe one day somebody will do, a documentary or something on it. I've never really pushed that, but really somebody should do a documentary because there were 7 of us during the 1976, 77, 78 graduating classes. 7 of us. Including recognizable names like Ravishing Rick Rude, Mr. Perfect Curt Hennig, Barry Darsow, who was Crusher Khrushchev, and then Demolition Smash for a long time. John Nord, who was known as Nord the Berzerker, the Barbarian. Tom Zink, the Z-Man. Brady Boone was maybe the lesser known, but nevertheless had a pretty good career as well. And then if you want to get real technical, Josh, Vern Gagne, the owner of the AWA, was a graduate of Robbinsdale High School back in, I think, the late 40s, went on to play, was a standout athlete at the University of Minnesota, eventually the owner of the American Wrestling Alliance, AWA. And one other name I'll throw out there, Mean Gene Okerlund was a graduate at Robbinsdale High School as well. So I think it was in the water tower, Josh.
Yeah, I guess so. Did you, since all those people kind of were all in the same high school at the same time, did you guys all hang out? Were you all wrestling fans? I mean, did you know each other pretty well as you guys were going through it?
So one year, five of the 7, we were all on the same high school football team one year. Now, everyone assumes that we must have had a state championship team, but as I point out, you need coaching besides players, right?
Yeah.
Right. And we just didn't have we were honestly, we were 500 ball club. We just didn't have great coaching. Some of us did hang out, and obviously in the weight room and things of that nature. Tom Zink went on to be won a Mr. Minnesota bodybuilding contest post high school. Brady Boone was a gymnast. So he was one of the earlier guys to do a lot of that flipping around in the ring and off the top turnbuckles, etc. But we really didn't. I mean, Curt Hennig, for anyone who knows their wrestling history, his dad, Larry the Axe Hennig, had a storied career, especially with the AWA, but just in general. And so I think, I've heard different stories. We didn't really talk about it. We knew his dad was a wrestler. Curt, I don't even really think was interested in getting in wrestling. In fact, we were both on the sidelines our freshman year in colleges, suffering injuries in a state championship game for at the college level. And it was then later that he would drop out of college and get into wrestling, as did several other. I mean, there's a plethora of guys from Minnesota. It's crazy, not just from Robbinsdale High School, but Minnesota in general, right?
Yeah. So that's interesting too. There's also legendary stories coming out of training out there. What was the training like when you were trying to get into wrestling?
Yeah. So the unique part about my story is, and I know a lot of guys I think automatically assume because we were all friends, or that we all went to training camp together. Of course, the name Eddie Sharkey's thrown out there a lot. In fact, I think you go on and you see my name somehow is attached to Eddie Sharkey. Again, I think it's just by association, right? Because we were all friends. Josh, the unique thing about my story, for those who maybe don't yet know it, is the day I walked into Jim Crockett's office in Charlotte, North Carolina, I had never even hit a ring rope. I'd never even been in a professional wrestling ring, nor did I have any amateur background experience, which I made sure Jim Crockett knew that prior to driving 1,200 miles from Minneapolis, Minnesota down to Charlotte. He said he was good with that. The day I walked in the office is the day Nikita Koloff was born. They partnered me with Ivan Koloff and Don Carnota, world tag team champions. And then I would debut the next night in Dorton Arena in Raleigh, having never been in a ring before in front of a sold-out crowd. It was crazy, Josh.
Wow. So, like, what did they tell you to do? I mean, I gotta just, before you go on, I gotta say, as somebody who has trained in wrestling, and people who there are people out there who don't know enough about wrestling. That is a very, very rare thing. I gotta imagine it was scary for you.
Yeah, I think the closest one, the one that comes closest to that was actually ended up being my nemesis in wrestling, Magnum TA, right? Terry Allen,
Yeah.
Magnum TA. Although he was kind of thrust into the limelight out in the Pacific Northwest with Buzz Sawyer, with very limited training. The word rare would be the right word for it. We actually even Crockett wanted, like that day I showed up, they put me on an interview set and they said, the whole storyline was I was going to be the nephew for Ivan Koloff, the Russian Bear. You don't speak any English. Take your shirt off, stand on the set every time they do an interview, look mean. Ivan put his chains around his neck. And so that's what we did for hours. And then we were supposed to get to Raleigh early, and we got there late. Not my fault. I was just along for the ride. So we didn't really even have time to get in the rings. They show me a couple basic things in the dressing room, right? No pressure, right, Josh?
Right.
A couple how to tie up, like how to lock up, and said, do this, and he's going to submit. And 11 seconds later, in front of a sold-out crowd, I had my first win in professional wrestling. But let me just tag one thing onto that. Crockett, because we didn't get there early, wasn't going to let me do it. To Ivan's credit, he talked him into letting me do it. And the only instructions Ivan gave me was what apparently Crockett told him was, if he trips on the ropes, he's history. He's out of here. So the only thing I think about is go to the ring. Don't trip on the ropes. Don't trip on the ropes. And one might think, how hard can that be? But to your point, Josh, if you've never been in a ring or tried to climb in a ring or had no training experience, it's a lot harder than you think.
Right. It totally is. And so now you were just really literally like learning on the road. Would you get there early? Would you get there early and bounce around a little bit as you were going?
Yep. Great question. So 11-second win on television, kind of set the stage. And by the way, they didn't know me from Adam, right? But because I went out with Ivan and Don, who were some pretty hot heels at that time, I was just hated by my association with them, right? So what the three of us would do for the next 2 or 3 months is what I guess I call on-the-job training. We'd get to the town a couple, 3 hours early. They'd bump and thump all over the ring and teach me the mechanics of wrestling. And then, what some people don't realize in that era or prior to this new generation, there was something called ring psychology. Like as you know, Josh, our matches weren't scripted. Our interviews weren't scripted. It was essentially, spontaneous, as we stepped into the ring. And so every night I'd sit in Don and Ivan's corner and watch their world tag team match. And on the drive home, we would discuss ring psychology. Why did they do what they did when they did it? And then I would begin to learn to listen to the crowd and then know what to do and when to do it by watching and observing them and then just going out the next night and putting it into practice.
Right. Wow. It's so funny you bring that up because I trained with Johnny Jeter, who trained at OVW with guys like Jim Cornette and those guys, and that's all he talks about is telling the story. Telling the story. What kind of story you're trying to tell, and the psychology of things, and making the moves matter, and doing taking one punch and selling the one punch instead of taking four punches, just so that one punch actually means something. And
right.
Very old school. Sounds like that's what they were trying to teach you.
Well, and they did. Well, and of course, obviously, Ivan Koloff was very old school, and so was Don Kernodle. So I learned old school psychology, and because of that, did my best to protect the business back then, because that's what we were taught and told to do. That we were projecting the reality of professional wrestling, and if you want to say not letting the cat out of the bag, that it was entertainment. It was entertainment, but we were still trying to project the realism of it all, right? And as some in the past, Dr. Death or Dr. David Schultz, hitting the breaking the eardrum of the news reporter, right? Just trying to protect the business, right? That's what we were taught to do. And so for your viewers out there that maybe aren't that familiar with wrestling, understand the product of that day. The challenge was to go in the ring, as you said, and spontaneously tell a story. I mean, if I was wrestling Ric Flair for an hour, which I did many, many, many times, 55 minutes of that match was spontaneous through verbal and nonverbal cues in the ring while we listened to the audience and drew them into the story leading into that outcome. And that was the art of the business, which it's no longer there, basically, because of writers and all that.
So tell me, what was it specifically that drew you to wrestling?
So it wasn't on my radar as a kid. I started lifting weights when I was 12. I picked up a magazine called Iron Man. It was a bodybuilding magazine. I was enamored by the pictures and remember thinking one day I want to look like one of those guys. At the age of 12, I bought a 110-pound plastic weight set with my paper route money, down at Sears and Roebuck, and began to lift weights. And I kind of fell in love with football and gravitated towards that. So all through junior high, high school, on into college, my goal, my dream, my vision was to play professional football. And I was scouted my senior year, small college in northern Minnesota called Moorhead State University. My quarterback backed up Phil Simms for the Giants for 4 years. That's how they discovered me, was scouting him. And I had a couple setbacks in my college days, injuries, but it didn't deter me from moving forward and pressing on to, fulfill my dream. And then what happened is a door of opportunity opened up along the way. I graduated college, training for that pro football tryout, rehabilitating from a fractured leg. When some of my buddies got into pro wrestling, known as the Road Warriors, Animal and Hawk. In fact, it's interesting. I recruited Animal out of New Brighton, Minnesota, out of Iredale High School to come play football in college with me. He dropped out. Next thing I know, he's on the Superstation TBS with a mohawk and painted face, right?
Right.
And then he, in turn, Josh, called me, in a sense, you might say, recruited me into pro wrestling. So it wasn't on my radar, but I thought, you know what? The tryout's not till 6 months down the road. Why not? I'll give it a shot. And hey, if it doesn't work out, then I still got the tryout for pro football. And of course, we know what happened, right? Those who know my story know what happened.
Yeah. Now, you said as a kid, it wasn't really on your radar. Did you watch wrestling at all? And tell me kind of your upbringing, what it was like.
So familiar with again, AWA was Vergania, headquartered in Minneapolis, right? And so their local show would be on all the time. I vaguely remember flipping through the channels, and for your younger viewers on the, just Google that. There were no remote controls. You actually had to get up and change the channel manually, just for the record. and so, I'd see All-Star Wrestling, AWA All-Star Wrestling. And, but I wasn't glued to the set. I was just familiar with it. And probably what my closest draw to it was, at one point I was working out at this little sweatbox gym in northern Minneapolis called Ventura's Gym. Some people might recognize the name Jesse the Body Ventura, later Governor Ventura. And so I got to know him a little bit. So we would try to watch, I try to maybe catch, like we say, hey, Jesse, you should say this on your interviews. And so we try to watch to see if he'd actually say it. And every now and then he would, right? We're like, oh, we told him to say that, right? We're college kids, right?
Yeah.
And then my first live match was at the St. Paul Civic Center. He was doing a deadlift competition against Paul Ellering. Some might know him as the manager of the Road Warriors.
Yeah.
And Josh, I remember there was about 25 of us muscleheads there who were Jesse Ventura fans and 18,000 others who were Paul Ellering fans. I'll never forget this. Like, the announcer's announcing the weight, and I'm looking, and I'm like, I'm not close enough where I can see the actual plates, but I'm close enough where I can kind of see him. And I hear what he's announcing over, the weights on the bar, and I'm trying to total it up in my head. And I'm like, I'm not good at math, but I don't think that guy knows how to count.
Yeah.
And then it was an aha moment. I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
Well, okay. Well, this is the part I want to get to real quick. We're leaving that night. I'll never forget. We're standing by the elevator. And this woman, she looked like she's 80 or 90 years old. I'm not kidding you. And I somehow made eye contact with her, and she stopped, and she looked at me, and she said, you, just like this, dude. She goes, you're those Jesse Ventura fans. She goes, if I had a knife, I'd stick it in your gut, and every one of you. I'm like, wow, there's some people like get really serious about this thing, man.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was my first introduction to live wrestling.
Man, it's funny. I actually went when I was touring. I'm an attorney by trade, and when I was looking at law schools, I got recruited to try go to Seton Hall. And when I was there, they were filming the movie with Mickey Rourke, the wrestler, in New Jersey at a Ring of Honor show. So I bought a front row ticket and went to the thing, and I was just like, this would be cool. I'm a wrestling fan, and all the guys who are big names now, Bryan Danielson and Seth Rollins, and all those guys were on the show. They were just coming up, and man, those fans, there was a guy who came, he brought his girlfriend because of the filming of the wrestler, and they were kind of making fun of it, because they weren't real wrestling fans. And I swear, those wrestling fans here in California, wrestling fans are not like the fans back east. You know what I mean? Right. These guys they seriously were like going to jump this guy because he wouldn't, not that of course they knew it was a show, but they were so annoyed at the guy for like kind of ruining the suspense that he almost got beat up,
right? Or whatever.
Yeah. They were pretty serious about it. And so I can imagine. And so now you growing up, I read that, you grew up with a single mom. Is that right?
I did. Yeah. Youngest of four, Minneapolis via Moscow, youngest of four. And life began a very, very humbling in what we call the projects, what I call the ghettos of Minneapolis Housing Authority, the official name. And during my elementary years, and then my mom eventually moved us out to the suburbs after my older sister and two older brothers had essentially more or less moved out, and they're a bit older than me. So then through my junior high school years, it was basically just me and my mom.
Yeah. So tell me now, that experience, how does that inform you later in life?
Yeah, I look back on it, certainly with no animosity or bitterness or anything of that nature. My dad leaving when I was around 3, he would later on come back into my life, come to some of my college football games, but it was a very superficial, really surface level relationship, because he just wasn't there. So I had no real male role model really to look up to one way or another. And so I think that's partly why too, Josh, that weightlifting, bodybuilding, and football just became my passion, where I lived, ate, and breathed. It was kind of my outlet, if you will. And so when I look back on my upbringing, it gives me certainly a much greater appreciation once I started tasting success, if you will.
Yeah.
And in fact, one time, tell you a little side story about the wrestling world. One time, the CPA for Jim Crockett pulled me aside and he said, "Cash your checks." I'm like, what are you talking about? He goes, "You're messing up my bookkeeping. Cash your checks." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" So I go home and I kid you not, because I didn't grow up with a lot of money, I'd get we get weekly checks from the Crockett's, and I just walk in and throw it up on the shelf in my closet. And sure enough, I went in, 13 checks were up there uncashed.
Jeez.
13. And couldn't even tell you how much they totaled up to. But the point was, my sister says I'm very frugal. That's, I guess, a polite way of saying I'm cheap, right? But
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
that to say, I have much respect for money because of my upbringing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I've said on this before when talking to other people, my parents, my parents are still together, but my dad had a pretty rough go. He's a recovered drug addict. We're Mormon. And so, but he recovered through that. And he ended up, anyway, 25, almost 30 years sober now. And, but it was a rough go. And so I remember thinking to myself all throughout high school and stuff, my parents only fought about drugs and money. And so I was like, well, if I don't do drugs and I make all the money, then things should be fine. And so I had a really healthy, respect for investments and money because of that experience, because they were always struggling because of those things. And so I just find it interesting hearing people's stories, like living with a single mom, not having the money, it seems like that is a common thread with a lot of people who are successful.
Yeah, in fact, I'm going to say this too for those out there. Maybe somebody might identify with this, and I know we're going to talk, more about this. But when I came to the faith in Jesus Christ, it was a while, Josh, where I had to work through what the term I would use, a poverty mentality, and what I mean by that is I really had to learn, like you read the Bible, you read scriptures, talk about. Be generous on every occasion. God loves a cheerful giver. And it wasn't that I wasn't willing to give or be generous, but there was a bit of a struggle there, full transparency. There was a bit of a struggle there, over those early formative years in being a Christ follower that I had to just kind of, if you will, open up my hands and kind of be willing not to keep such a tight grip on money, on finances. And so I'm very grateful through that process and because of what I've learned.
Yeah. Well, another thing, and I wanted to talk to you about this, of course, we want to talk about your wrestling career, but one of the things that I find so fascinating about you and like guys like you and Sting, who you guys were, you guys had a famous feud, but you both kind of went a different route in that when so many people of your generation kind of went south, I guess you could say, you guys somehow found a solace in that by finding Jesus and being Christian. And I'm just curious what it was that brought you to that.
Yeah, a number of my peers, right? So whether it's myself, Sting, Lex Luger, which we talk about that too. Him and I run a camp. The shirt I'm wearing, Man Camp, is a camp that he and I host every spring and fall down a little town called Royston, Georgia. We'll have one coming up here at the end of April. Will be our next one. Small groups of men that we bring in to really empower them and equip them to be godly men, godly husbands, godly fathers, send them home, hopefully to hear some great stories on how they implemented the things they learned at camp, right? I didn't grow up in church, so let's get a little more backstory for your viewers. I didn't grow up in church, but that's not to say I wasn't familiar with the story, right? The man Jesus crucified on a cross, spikes driven through his hands, his feet, a spear through his side. I knew the story, But for the first 34 years of my life, that story never made the 18-inch trip from my head down to my heart. And so there was no life transformation for me. What led to that decision was nothing dramatic. You'll hear some of the different stories, like what you just mentioned. Your dad was addicted to drugs or whatever, right? Or I was addicted to alcohol, or in and out of jail, numerous times, and so you hear those different types of stories where somebody hit, you might say, rock bottom, and then that led them, as they're flat on their back, that led them to look up towards heaven and ask for Jesus to come in their life. That's not my story. My story, the shorter version of it is, I leave wrestling. I'm on this quest, if you will, this journey for what life holds next for Nikita Koloff. And in fact, I wrote about this in one of my books, Wrestling with Success. And I think a whole chapter devoted to this. I was successful, Josh, but I was unfulfilled.
Yeah.
And there was just this void in my heart that you might think being a world champion or a, quote, famous wrestler might fill that void, but it didn't. It might have temporarily, but nothing sustaining, long-term sustaining. All that to say, through some other business ventures, I met a Christian couple who had invited me to their church a few times, and it was just a divine appointment for me. I called them up one day. I said, I'll be there Sunday morning. I'm coming to your church. And they're like, we'll meet you there. They did. An invitation was given to come to the altar, and it was an aha moment for me. And what I mean by that is I'm like, okay, I think I just figured out what's missing in my life. And that's this personal relationship with Jesus Christ. I've never asked him into my heart. I've never done that. And I went forward that day, Josh, on my knees, confessing and repenting. And I can say for the record that if I had died that day, I would have died a fulfilled man, because the minute I did that, received Christ, there was also just this sense of fulfillment, that life was complete at that point, even if I did nothing else. And with Sting and Lex, the Road Warriors prior to their passing, Uncle Ivan prior to his passing, I've had a small role in different ways in a number of those guys that led them to that same conclusion, that same decision, realizing all the money in the world, all the fame and fortune and glamour and glitz and climbing the corporate ladder and everything else is but temporary. And the one conclusion we have all come to grips with was that without a personal relationship with Jesus, it's all, as Solomon said in Ecclesiastes, meaningless. It's all meaningless. In fact, last thing I'll say, most recently, Mark Callis, the Undertaker, has become public with his faith in Christ, and just prior to this past Christmas season, Hulk Hogan and his new wife both got baptized in the Baptist church where they attend there in Tampa. So I think, Josh, more and more people realize, or at least my peers realize, that all of that other stuff is just meaningless at the end of the day when it's all said and done.
It's interesting what you brought up, which I thought was really interesting. You were successful but not fulfilled. And it's interesting to hear that, because I think that the normal person would listen to you're being adorned. Well, you were being booed most of the time. You did have a face run, but you were pretty nasty heel there for a while. But I mean, you're wrestling in front of 10, 15, 20,000 fans. You're holding championships. You're living the what was viewed as the party lifestyle, in your 20s and 30s and beyond. And yet this moment that you have in a church by yourself is the one that makes you fulfilled. And that's just I think that's really interesting. I find that very, very interesting as a Christian myself, but also as someone who has, I think anybody out there who is successful has like a bit of a superiority complex and an inferiority complex, right? Like everything, you think you can do everything better than everybody else, but then you also kind of think that nothing you do is really good enough, right? And like, yet, you're always chasing that thing that's going to be it. And for you, it was just having a personal relationship with your Savior. And I think that says a lot.
Yeah, it's the chasing of the brass ring, right? And again, you don't have to be a professional athlete. You were one. You have a law background, you said, and I know plenty of other successful people who are not athletes. Climbed the corporate ladder, became millionaires or nowadays billionaires. But I think what's interesting, I'll tell you this little side story. So Lex Luger at one point was thinking of getting into the movies. This is prior to The Rock or anything else, right? So, and he goes out to Hollywood to look for a home, and they take him to Malibu, right? Because the realtor says that's where all the stars live, right? All the stars live in Malibu. Lex, you need to look for a house in Malibu. So they take him there, and he's looking around, and of course he's a very inquisitive guy, and he's very smart. Anyone who spends any time around Lex, he really is. And he says, I got a question. What's the number one industry here? And he said the realtor almost starts laughing. And he's like, is that funny? Like, is that a funny question? And he goes, well, you might be surprised. And he goes, well, tell me. He goes, drug rehabs. And at that time, Josh, they had the most drug rehabs in any city in the U.S. They had 125, if I remember right, drug rehabs in Malibu for all of the successful movie stars.
Wow.
Drug rehabs, number one industry in Malibu. Lex was like taken aback, like, oh my gosh. So, we look at all these stars, music stars and movie actors, and we see them all up on the silver screen, the glitz and the glamour. Even Lex. Like, if anyone knows Lex's story, go get his book, Wrestling with the Devil, and read his story. What you saw appear on television was not reality. Reality, and Sting had a similar story. Behind the scenes, off camera, their lives were train wrecks.
Yeah.
I mean, it let that whole, as you said, that whole party lifestyle that some like really try to grab hold of or run after with everything they have. Many of them find out when it's all said and done, this isn't what it was cracked up to be. I'm still miserable. I'm still depressed. I'm still fighting anxiety, and I have no peace in my life. And I've come to the conclusion, anyway, the one thing and the only thing that'll bring a peace that surpasses all understanding is accepting and receiving Jesus Christ into your life. That's it, for period. That, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. It's interesting. We're in a very, very, as someone who's been involved in the business at the highest levels, we're in a very interesting, I feel like, transition period in that, we talked a little bit off air about Vince McMahon, and I know that you were like the only guy ever left that never worked for the WWF. You were a Turner guy through and through, a WCW guy, and never worked there. But it's so interesting to see someone so powerful and so strong and really at the top of his game almost lose his entire legacy because of just allegations of depravity. And you work a lot with, it sounds like you work with a lot of different people who have had to come back from something like that. Perhaps you can talk about, in that context, working with people like that, how you kind of pull them out of that if you can.
Yeah, I mean, great question. I mean, the immediate scripture that pops in my mind, as you're bringing up that current scenario, that very recent scenario is your sin will find you out. We can try to conceal our lifestyles and live this secretive, hidden life all we want, and may even have some success with it for a while. But ultimately, I was thinking about this earlier today. I forget why, but this expression, time will either expose you or promote you. Mm-hmm. Time will either expose you or promote you. It's not a matter of if, it's only a matter of when. which the challenge for all of us then is to live as clean a life as we can possibly live, forgiven for those things we've done in the past, and hopefully there's some reconciliation or redemption there. And if not, then that possibility is always there. Our camps, the camps that Lex and I facilitate and host, guys come into those camps, Josh, with all different backgrounds, from 18-year-old and up. The oldest one's been in his mid-70s, a retired pastor, construction workers. We've had homeless and millionaires rooming together, at our camp, so that there's we don't discriminate against anybody, and they all come in for different reasons. And yet invariably every single one of them, while they carve out a handful of days and spend them with us, will find in that setting, when they get away from the noise and the rat race of life and just really quiet their soul, if you will, that some things will come into the light that can either help, I say it this way, either help set them free or help heal them of past hurts or things that have wounded, or people that have wounded them in the past. And I don't believe that anybody is not beyond redemption. They just have to be willing to go there and open up and be transparent enough to receive what God has waiting for them. That makes sense. It kind of addresses what you're asking.
Yeah, it does. And I've seen it, I've seen it in my own father, and I've seen it in my own life, right? It's it's funny. I was thinking about what you were saying about millionaires and homeless. Another thing that kind of exemplifies is, I for a long time, I'm almost 43 years old, and I've been an attorney for 12 years, and I've done everything. I've been really blessed beyond my measure with regard to what the success I've had. And but the funny thing is growing up in the background that we did, like I said, it was like, oh, if I have all the money, things are going to be fine. And I had in my head, I was like, well, if I had the big house, the nice car, my kids all had college educations, I had the movie theater and the pinball machine and all the stuff I always wanted as a kid, then I'd be happy. And I noticed that every one of those things, I'd get them and they'd be cool for a month or two, and then it'd be on to the next thing. And the only thing that really sustained me was what you were talking about, which is meaning which I find meaning very similar to yours, is through service through Christ, right? And then also on top of that, good, meaningful, positive experiences with the people I love. And, you obviously have a fond relationship with Lex Luger if you're doing this together. Talk to me about what that means to you, being someone who traveled the road with these guys and now have this ability to give back in this way, what that means to you.
Yeah, it's really kind of crazy to think about because when I leave wrestling, really my official last match is November 92. About 11 months later, I find myself at an altar, 17 October 1993, giving my life to Christ. And then that sets me on this 30 plus year journey of traveling the world to share my story and hopefully, impact some people's lives in a positive way. And so Lex and I were separated for about 11 years. I saw him again in December of 1995. They were wrestling in Charlotte. And so I went down to the arena and just kind of, say hi to all the guys. Hadn't seen any of them in almost 3 years since I had left wrestling. So it was, great to see all the guys. And then I didn't see Lex again until June of 2006. And, I heard all kinds of stories and rumors. And, you talked about some of my peers, Sting and I and others have taken a better path than, unfortunately, even some of my high school friends, right? Like Curt Hennig, Ravishing Rick Rude, who's no longer, Tom Zink and Brady Boone. All four of those guys who graduated a year ahead of me are no longer with us. And I believe because of poor choices for some of them, as well as other wrestlers, had premature deaths. Okay. And so I hear the rumors about Lex, and they think he's going to be the next dead wrestler, right? Just because of his lifestyle, and didn't realize, again, off camera, I mean, he's taking pills and he's drinking, all kinds of liquor and booze and that whole deal. And then I hear that a jail chaplain befriends him in his last trip to jail, and eventually leads him. I'll condense the story. Eventually leads him to Christ in the same hotel room he was living in, where 6 months prior he almost overdosed of drugs.
Wow!
And leads him to Christ. And so I reach out to him. We connect. Comes out to a conference in Arizona, and we really bonded there. Like in wrestling, we were just professional on a professional level, right? We weren't really the best of buddies, although we did travel together. I think back to some fun times when Luger and Sting and Road Warrior Animal and I, all four of us would travel in a car. We don't have time for all those stories tonight, Josh. Maybe another show. But if any wrestling fans out there can picture that, the Russian Nightmare, Road Warrior Animal, the Total Package, and the Stinger all traveling together on the road. But and then to have a small role in seeing many of these guys, come to Christ is so heartwarming. I mean, Ivan, I invited Ivan to a revival, had no idea he would come, but I felt prompted to invite him. And I didn't know he was even there that night, Josh, until I saw him standing at an altar to give his life to Jesus.
Wow.
That's when I first knew he was in the building. And that night, you want to talk about a genuine encounter? That night, Ivan was set free of drug addiction, alcohol addiction, tobacco addiction. I don't know another cuss word ever came out of his mouth after that night at that altar. And so just again, how gratifying is that for me, I guess, to really get to your question, to know in some small way I've had opportunities to impact some of my wrestling peers.
Yeah. Going back to wrestling, I know wrestling fans are going to be listening to this. I'm like, you didn't talk hardly at all about wrestling, but I got to ask you a couple of questions. One of them being, what would you say, who is the person during those years that you think you bonded with the most? Like, who was your best buddy when you were going through all that?
Certainly, right out of the gate, Ivan.
Mm-hmm.
Ivan. People are like, once they find out he wasn't really my uncle, I'm like, yeah, well, he was more of an uncle to me, or as much of an uncle to me as any of my uncles in my life, right?
Right.
Him and Don Kernodle taking me under their wing. I would not have had the career I had they not sacrificed their body every night for a couple, 2-3 months, those first formative months in the business, teaching me the ropes, pun intended. And so, certainly Don and Ivan and I, we were friends well past our wrestling careers, right up to the time. In fact, I was asked to be the key speaker at Don's funeral. He had always promised me I would do that, and I wanted to be a man of my word. And so I spoke at Don's funeral, and then at a small private only graveside funeral for Ivan. I was asked to be the key speaker at his funeral, and which I was honored to do. And so certainly Don and Ivan were two. Once I flipped the switch, saw the light, you might say, Josh, became a good guy, and partnered with the American Dream, doth the role, the tower of power to be power, if you will. Yeah. Once we became the superpowers, I had a couple fun years riding up and down the road in his little 2-seater red convertible Mercedes Benz. Man, we laughed, and we had, if I pass away of any regrets, there might be one. And here's the one. For years, I drove and flew around the towns and talked about going into partnership, and buying like 1,000 acres, like out in Montana where the snow-capped mountains and antelope roam, right?
Right.
We never pulled the trigger, never did it. And to this day, I kind of kicked myself. I'm like, man, why didn't we do that? But those are the kind of things we talked about and just had fun. So those three guys, and then of course Luger, Sting. Sting is a dear friend. Luger, Magnum TA, my nemesis. the best of 7 series for the U.S. title, right?
Yeah.
Magnum and I talk on a very frequent basis. I've had him come to some of the services I've done and share his story, how the Lord sustained him through a broken neck and a career-ending injury, and how it was Jesus who sustained him through that whole injury. And so Magnum is a dear friend, and those are some of the ones that come to mind.
Yeah, man. So, where would you say is your favorite feud?
By far the best of 7 against Magnum, and it's the most talked about. When I go out, I was just out this past weekend in Logan, West Virginia, doing an autograph signing. And what I love about the autograph signings is, people share their stories. I love hearing their stories, their memories of the Russian Nightmare, right? Whether it was a live match or loving to boo me or hate me or whatever, right? All those kind of stories are just fascinating to me now. And so, I mean, that's the opportunity to get out into that, still be a part of that business in that capacity, and be able to kind of rub elbows, with the fans. A couple others that come to mind, the very first ever Great American Bash against the Nature Boy Ric Flair. I mean, Josh, if you think about the story I told you earlier, how I broke into wrestling, right?
Right.
Fast forward 13 months from that debut in the Dorton Arena in Raleigh, from an 11-second win in Dorton. Fast forward 13 months, almost to the day, and I'm wrestling in the first ever Great American Bash main event for the World Heavyweight title against a guy named the Nature Boy Ric Flair, already the World Tag Team Champion and the World Six-Man Champion in just 13 months with no experience, no background, no training, and I'm wrestling the World Heavyweight Champion for his belt. Are you kidding me? Like, wow, right?
Right.
And then the other one I'll mention just real quick too, for your viewers out there is the first ever War Games. First ever War Games was incredibly memorable as well.
Yeah. Now was that the one where you did the hug with Sting, or was that a later one?
That would be later on, where I became part of Sting's squadron. That wasn't the original War Game. The original War Games was Dusty and I, the Road Warriors, and Precious Paul against the Four Horsemen and J.J. Dillon.
That's right. I remember that. It was funny. I'll tell you, you want to hear stories, I'll tell you mine. I remember one of the thing that I remember the most about your career was, I think it was the first Super Brawl where the Steiners were working against Sting and Luger, and you came in and bashed Sting and started your feud with him. And it ended with that. Go ahead.
No. I'm sorry. Yeah, it ended with the hug, right?
Yeah, it ended with the hug. Yeah.
So quick backstory on that. So I'd taken a hiatus. I'd taken some time off. Had a wife die of cancer. Some know that, some don't know that. She was 24 when she was. It was detected. She was 26 when she passed away. Took time off to take care of her. I mean, I walked away from main event to take care of her. The office wasn't happy, but I just felt it was the right thing to do, right?
Yeah.
And so walked away from main event status, gave up a contract to go take care of her. So when I was ready to come back, they were convinced I could be a heel again. Even after we did the whole turn with Magnum, I cry a tear for Magnum TA, right? Pro Wrestling Illustrated, a whole deal. So they said, we'll put you against Luger. He's, our second hottest baby face, right? So we do the deal. We're in Arizona. I smack him upside the head with the belt and presenting a new belt to him. And that creates that angle. And 50% of the people cheer me and 50% cheer him, right? And they eventually figure out, realize, well, maybe you're right. I tell you what we'll do. We'll put you against the hottest baby face. That's Sting.
Right.
And so in St. Pete, that's where we did the deal you're referring to, where the idea was I'm coming down to continue, the attack on Luger. He ducks. I hit Sting by accident. And of course, he and I fight out into the parking lot, and that creates the angle with him to where I eventually, we kind of, if you will, kind of kiss and make up and give him the hug a few months later to try to make up. Now, I'll say for the record too, a lot of people don't know this. I had a little girl with me all painted up with Stinger stuff,
Right.
just to try to appeal to him. That was my oldest daughter, Taryn, right? My oldest daughter.
Right.
And I said, now, honey, when daddy asks you who your favorite wrestler is, please do not say my daddy, Nikita Koloff, right?
Right.
So make sure you say Sting, So
Right.
anyway, little side story there.
Well, the reason that sticks out in my mind now is because they recently had a War Games where Charlotte Flair and Becky Lynch did the hugs similar to you and Sting, and I thought nice, kind of nice throwback to what you guys did, and it just goes to show, I find that wrestling, the thing that people don't understand is wrestling is all about moments, the moments that stick with you, and,
Yep.
and there's a lot of moments, Hogan slamming Andre, and Mick Foley getting thrown off a cage. Your hug with Sting at War Games for me was one of those moments.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool, and they did that throwback to you, and I thought that was pretty meaningful that they were willing to do that.
I'll tell you one other little too is that meaningful for a lot of the fans going back to coming to Dusty's rescue in the cage and doing the whole babyface turn was Magnum's first back in Baltimore, Crockett Cup. Magnum comes out for the very first time since the accident, makes it down to ringside, and that embrace with Magnum at ringside. I don't think, honestly, I don't think there was a dry eye in the building that night.
Yeah, man, that's awesome. And looking back now, I mean, now that you've been around for a few years, you've lived a pretty full life. What would you
Yes, sir.
say of all the things is your biggest success?
Oh, wow. Great question. Because I don't know, really, I don't know that I've ever been asked in that way before, and try to narrow it down there. I have, it's interesting you say that. I have lived a very blessed life. There's no question, no doubt. When I look back on what I've done, I remember one time, and I'm in, hitting my mid 60s, right? Josh, back in my mid 30s, after leaving wrestling, I had a guy say to me then, well, you've done more in your first, 30 something years than most people do in a lifetime. And I'm like, wow, but there's a lot of life ahead of me. Right. And so fast forward 30 years later, and now I think, 36 different countries I've traveled to, all 50 states. I've ministered to an audience of one. I've ministered to the largest audience to date, which Luger was with me, by the way, was over 73,000 in Jamaica.
Wow.
Sting and I did a huge dramatization in the old Dome in Indiana for over 43,000 teenagers. We saw over 10,000 respond to the altar that night from our testimonies and our dramatization. Gosh, I mean, to narrow it down or to pin it down, I guess feeling fortunate to travel and see the world and experience so many different cultures, considering where it all began back in those projects of Minneapolis. I do honestly sometimes feel like I need to pinch myself to make sure it's all real, Josh. When I think about all that I've done, and I will say this too, because if I said this once, I said this numerous times. So I have facilitated roughly about 80 of these camps, and it's just small groups of men. We try to limit it usually like to 24 guys. And when I see the impact that it has on those men, and then hear the stories later, how a marriage was restored, how a relationship between a dad and a daughter was restored, or a dad and a son, or this person was healed, right? And of this affliction, physical affliction in his life. I can't put a price tag on any of that, and all the money in the world doesn't compare to any of that. Lex and I one time tried to calculate when he first heard I left wrestling. It was right before the pay-per-view, or right before all the big fat contracts, right? All the big explosion in pay-per-view. And so he and I sat down one time and said, well, let's kind of conservatively calculate what you think I walked away from, Lex. And on a conservative level, we figure I've walked away from probably no less than 50 million.
Wow.
$50 million. Oh, on a conservative level, right? Could have been double that, triple that, right? Or more. I say that to say not one regret in that regard do I look back and go, I wish I had stayed. I wish I'd taken advantage of all those big fat contracts. When I see one person's life changed for the better and it impacts the kingdom of God, there's no price I can put on that, Josh.
That's awesome. Now, here's another question I ask. I tend to ask everybody, and that is, I think you learned so much from failure. So, what would you say was your biggest failure, and what did you learn from it?
So, I mentioned some injuries in college, and I sustained my freshman year. I sustained a fractured tibia and fibula. Those are the lower bones in your leg. Any avid football fans out there might remember Joe Theismann when Lawrence Taylor broke his leg in half. And so that's essentially the fracture I sustained in my freshman year in college. I'll never forget my high school football coach when I saw him later that following spring. And he said, I heard about your injury. Wow, sorry to hear about that. Nobody ever comes back from an injury like that. Well, you can take that one of two ways, right? You can use that as motivation or go into a deep depression and think, you're never going to pull out of it. I chose to use it as motivation, came back to play 3 more years, only to fracture my other leg in a game and break it in half. But now I'm 4 years older. I feel a little bit more mature and experienced, and knowing I could come back from one, I could come back from the other. And then, of course, went on to have this career in pro wrestling without any repercussions from any of those injuries. And so I would tell your viewers out there that in life, we're going to be faced with many failures and setbacks, but you never have to let a setback or a failure hold you back. You can use it as a setup for a comeback. Yeah. And so no matter what you might fail at, I look at it this way, Josh. I'm going to grow and I'm going to learn from any and every failure. I'm not going to go into any depression. I'm going to use it as motivation to pick myself up, dust myself off, and move forward. And if not successful in whatever that endeavor is, use the learning lessons from that to be successful in another endeavor.
Well, and I think that's the true meaning of faith, right? It's easy to be faithful when things are going good, right? And the one thing I've seen, and I believe this to be true, is that sometimes failures happen, and in the midst of the failure, you sit there and you go, man, this isn't fair. This isn't what I should be dealing with, right? But if you believe in God and you understand everything happens for a reason, sometimes when you look, like I can't think of something that is a failure in my life, and there's been many, and there's been some deep ones and some deeply hurtful things that have happened. But you look back and you go, man, that had to happen to get me to this other place that was so much better that even I couldn't even imagine. My life looks so much different than I ever would have expected it to look. And some of it would look at some of the things that have happened to get me there and think they're really tragic. But it's turned me into a person and given me a life that I didn't even know was my dream life. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, absolutely, 100%. And let me, and again, I'm going to emphasize this to your viewers. Listen to this. That we sometimes can get caught up in what you're pointing to is asking the why, right? Why did this happen? Why am I going through this? Why? And for the record, I don't think there's anything wrong with asking why. God's a big enough God to handle your why. Jesus asked on the cross, why have you forsaken me? So I don't think there's anything wrong with the why. But Josh, what I've learned through all of my past failures is no longer to ask why, because it's happened. I've instead decided to ask what. What is the lesson in this? Why am I going through this? Is okay. But more important, I believe, is what do you want me to learn from this so that hopefully you don't have to repeat it again. Okay. Right. So yeah, learn the lesson, learn the what, so you don't have to repeat it again. And that's like Magnum. Magnum never one time asked God, why did this happen to me? Not once, ever. broken neck, never once asked why. He just said, okay, this is what's happened. How am I going to make the best of my life from this?
Wow. I got one last question for you before we wrap up, and that is, someday far along down the road, you're going to pass away. And when you do, there'll be a funeral and a eulogy. What do you hope is the one thing someone says about you in your eulogy?
Wow. Nose prints on the window.
Yeah.
Nose prints on the window. What does he mean by that? There's a lot of different ways that we can define success, right? Success is a relative term, right? What one person views as success, might be completely different for someone else. I'm a dad. I've got 11 grandkids,
Wow.
and counting. So 11 and counting. And I walk into my daughter's house this most recent time. My 8-year-old grandson turned, saw me, bolted across the room, jumped into my arms and hugged me until I was ready to let him down and stop hugging him. And my daughter looked and was just kind of taken aback by his embrace, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by nose prints on the window, when prior to grandchildren, when I was raising children, one of the ways I define success is, man, if those kids are standing there pressing their faces up against the window waiting for dad to come home, is there any greater feeling than that, or any more success you could achieve than those children just longing for and waiting for dad to get home, that they could embrace you, that they could hug you, that they could love on you, and then set the tone for their future lives. And then in turn, then that's now passed down, and I'm experiencing that with my grandchildren. So I hope, all that to say, I hope that others may say, more than anything else, he learned to love.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Learned to love.
Man, that's awesome. Well, I got to tell you, as somebody, this has been, I've done a lot of wrestling interviews, and I got to tell you, this is probably one of the top ones, because you can just tell a lot of these guys that I talk to, quite frankly, lives didn't turn out the way that they'd hoped. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Some people are grateful, some people are regretful. And I can tell that it sounds like you got out at the right time and really had a second career that was even more meaningful than the first. And I think that that's really amazing. And tell me, while we got you, we're wrapping up. Where can people find your work?
So I try to make it as simple. I try to live a very simple life now, right? I try to make it as simple as possible. So I'll give you that website here in just a moment, give you a chance to grab a pen or whatever you need to do to write it down. But on that website, you can connect with me in many different ways. Like if you want to learn more about the man camp, you're a woman out there and you're like, man, I'd love for my husband or my significant other, we're looking at getting married one day or something, or you want to send him to that camp so we can empower him and equip him and send him back home to just be a godly man, a good man and a godly man. You can go to the website and link to the man camp. Our next one's at the end of April. 2 books you'll find in my store are my newly updated Ring of Redemption, Nikita Ring of Redemption. And actually, if you don't like hard copy, I went in the studio last year and in my own voice, now available on Audible, go on Amazon or wherever else, you can download my life story from as far back as I can remember to present day and get the full story. Now, if you order off my website, you'll get it personally autographed. But both books are available there. I've got a podcast and a radio show on Truth Radio Network called The Man Up Show, and a TV show. And you can go on the website and link to all the shows and link to all of social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. All ready? Here you go. Koloff, last name, Koloff, Koloff.net. If you go to Koloff.net, you can find me, follow me, Spread the word. Josh, that podcast so far has been downloaded in 93 different countries, and I'm looking for help. Get it to 100. So I appreciate you having me on tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you coming on, and I just want you to know that I, as a wrestling fan, have been moved by your work there and also your work afterwards, which is why I'm glad that we were able to have this. So for those of you listening, follow Nikita Koloff and his work because it's really meaningful, and it's always great to speak to somebody who really leads with his heart, and I can tell you do. So
thank you, sir. And I just appreciate you and out there. Thank you for giving me the taking the time to listen, and for you, Josh, giving me the time for this interview. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we'll catch you guys next time. Subscribe, and we'll see you later.